Figures from the Office for National Statistics show the UK economy grew 0.3% in the 3 months up to August. Responding to the figures, the Treasury said we've seen the fastest growth in the G7 since the start of the year. But for too many people, our economy feels stuck, working day in, day out without getting ahead. They say the Chancellor is determined to turn this around by helping businesses in every town and high street grow, investing in infrastructure and cutting red tape to get Britain building. Paul Kelso can tell us more now on how the economy is doing and the challenge ahead for the Chancellor. Paul.
Well, we've heard there the Chancellor's priorities. We've got growth figures today to put it in context, and some speculation and forecasts from a leading think tank on what might happen in the budget. That's the context for everything. It's about a month away. Let's look at the growth figures first of all. These are the 3-month trend line. The red line here is 3 monthly trends. We see the figures for August. Growth grew a little bit, 0.3%. That's a bit more than the trend was in July. It's a bit of a weakening of the economy from the first half of the year. Still puts us nearly the top of the pile in the G7. The main driver, the blue chunk here, the sector of the economy driving that growth, was services. Bit of a slowdown in production and construction bouncing back. What does growth mean, this kind of growth? Well, it's helpful to the Chancellor, but what real impact will it have on the big picture? Let's take a look at that and what people think lies ahead for the Chancellor. That figure there at the end, £10 billion of headroom, that is against the Chancellor's own fiscal rules. We talk about them a lot. It's essentially her self-imposed restrictions that she wants public spending to be funded by tax revenues by the end of this Parliament, plus £10 billion of headroom. That's what was built in the March 2012 forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Now, what's changed since then? The Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is a well-regarded think tank, has done some sums with Barclays to work out what lies ahead for the Chancellor when the OBR does its forecast in November, and they don't make good reading. First of all, £6 billion. Remember welfare reforms at that March forecast? The government was going to cut welfare. The backbenchers weren't having it. So you take that away, the headroom's down to £4 billion by the time the budget needs to be done. What else? Borrowing costs. Partly because of that welfare decision and the lack of political power it appeared that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister had, borrowing costs went up. That wipes another £5 billion off. Look, that headroom's disappeared. We're now into negative territory. The Chancellor's got a hole to fill. And then we add in what people think will happen to the forecast on growth. Lower economic growth, perhaps in part because of the tax rises that came in the first budget. That wipes off another £11 billion. You are left with, let's use the Chancellor's terminology, a black hole of £22 billion. That's minus 11 and that £10 billion. So lots of speculation about how she might fill it. She's ruled out the big tax rises because of Labour's manifesto pledge not to increase income tax and the like. So you're left with a hodgepodge of measures, all of which might have unintended consequences. But there's another way of thinking about this that the IFS has suggested. What if she's bold? What if, instead of trying to get back to another £10 billion of headroom and finding £22 billion, what about she bites the bullet and tries to find £32 billion, so she gets extra headroom? That'll give her more room for manoeuvre. Of course, the downside of that is you've got to fill that hole. But what might the benefits of finding the extra headroom be? Well, there's one in particular. These borrowing costs, which were driven up by that lack of headroom and by these politically difficult choices, well, they might get cheaper. The markets might have more confidence with a government that was taking really tough decisions to give it room for manoeuvre and get out of this loop of every 6 months having to meet a self-imposed target. They might be able to borrow at cheaper rates. Of course, the problem with that is these are really politically difficult choices. That's even more tax. It's even more spending cuts. And we've seen how difficult they are. But instead of a doom loop, you might have a virtuous circle. It's all very well for economists and indeed journalists to speculate about this. Of course, if you're the Chancellor, actually making that happen is much harder. We'll find out what she's going to do about it in a month, and we'll hear from her later today.